Good morning. So today we're looking at the process of cellular respiration in your textbooks. Is from pages 184 to 195. Okay, so cellular respiration, it occurs in the cells of all plants and animals like us. Basically, what cellular respiration is about is making energy for our bodies to be able to move, or for growth, for us to grow, and so on. So it's basically the process that gives us energy to do the things we need to do in our daily lives for plants and animals. Okay, so I hope you guys remember about ATP. This is the molecular structure of ATP. ATP is the chemical composition that gives us energy. So this would be one ATP molecule. All the phosphor links here, and we have a sugar molecule over here and an amino acid over here. So basically ATP and all these things, the cellular respiration happens usually within the mitochondrial or the mitochondria organelle within the cell. Okay, so there are two types of cellular respiration pathways or way that we can make energy. First of all is your aerobic respiration, and secondly anaerobic. Let's take a close look at our aerobic respiration. So what aerobic means is that energy is being produced when we have oxygen. So everything happens when the cells have oxygen. Okay, so let's take a look at a general cell, a living cell of any animal. Let's take the human. So we have our nucleus, and over here the cytoplasm, it's like the liquid inside the cell, and then here is the mitochondrion. Mitochondrion, one singular, and mitochondria, plural, more than one, two mitochondria. Okay, so taking a closer look, this now represents this yellow color, the cytoplasm or the cytosol. I think that's the American way of saying it. And then our mitochondrion over here, this funny bean-shaped thing, organelle. Okay, so basically your aerobic respiration happens in three stages. First stage happens within the cytosol, and stage 2 within the mitochondrion, and also stage 3 also inside the mitochondrion. Okay, so first of all, the first step is known as glycolysis. So what happens is when we have a glucose molecule, this is now the food for our cell. The glucose is going to be broken down into smaller pieces known as pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Okay, smaller pieces, usually 2 of these molecules are being formed. Okay, so during the process of glycolysis, that's being broken down, 2 hydrogen atoms will be released. Over here, this pathway shows it binds with the coenzyme NAD. Don't worry about the full name at the moment. So this binds now, and then this goes and will be used, these 2 hydrogen molecules, the H at the back here, is being carried by the coenzyme, and it will be used at the last stage again. Okay, so 2 hydrogen atoms is being produced, or 2 ATP is produced. Well, sorry, and 2 ATP. Okay, so that will be used later on, but also apart from that, 2 ATP, 2 of these adenosine triphosphate molecules, energy molecules, is being produced. Okay, with lightning bolt representing energy is being released over here. Okay, then these pyruvate molecules go inside the mitochondrion, and now it goes and it will be broken down during the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. Okay, you don't have to know all the nitty-gritty details of what happens during this cycle, but you have to know that during this process, it's actually incorrect. ATP is not produced here. That shouldn't be here. What happens is that more hydrogen atoms are being released. So coenzymes such as your NAD and your FAD binds, or the hydrogen binds to these coenzymes. Remember, coenzyme is a type of protein that facilitates or help during certain processes. Okay, so a lot of hydrogen atoms are being released during this breakdown process, Krebs cycle, and all these hydrogen atoms are now being taken to the last step. It will be used in the last step. We just call it the oxidative phosphorylation step. Okay, so Also occurs in the mitochondria, and what happens here is also more hydrogen atoms are being released, but during this last stage, the most ATP is produced. So the ATP, the circle should only be here and should be here. 2 is formed at the start, and actually 36 ATP molecules is formed because of oxidative phosphorylation at the last bit. Okay, and as I mentioned, the energy produced in the first step is used in the last step as well. And also during oxidative phosphorylation, water is being released. So all these hydrogen atoms that are being released in this step, as they break, as the bonds break, the bonds form all this ATP, this energy, but those hydrogens atoms, they combine with oxygen. That's why we need the oxygen for the last step, and then you get water. Water is released as a byproduct. Okay, over here is a beautiful schematic representation of the chemical formula of what happens. You have one glucose molecule. It reacts with oxygen in the last step. It reacts. Then what happens is you end up with carbon dioxide that is being released into the air, and also water. As I mentioned in the last step, water is produced, and obviously your ATP. So in total, you will have 38 ATP. 2 at the front, 36 from the last step, and you end up with 38 ATP. I'm stressing that because this process of aerobic respiration is very energy rich. So it's an energy rich process. So there are primarily 2 factors that also attributes or plays a role within aerobic respiration and also adds to the rate or the speed at which it happens. First of all is your enzymes. So during the breakdown process of each step, there are certain enzymes, apart from the coenzymes, but there are enzymes that helps break down these molecules. As you remember with photosynthesis, these molecules are very temperature sensitive. Just waiting for the bell. So if your temperature is too high, what can happen is these enzymes can actually denature and they can die down. But temperature by itself also plays a role because as the temperature rises to a certain degree, this entire process will speed up. Okay, so you don't want the heat to be too much, otherwise the enzymes die out. But you want the temperature to be kind of high in the 20-30s degrees because then this process happens quicker. So that's also known as your metabolic rate. So the rate at which this metabolism, this breakdown process happens. The same happens with if you run a mile or you exercise. Your metabolic rate will increase. You are actually giving off heat, and you're also producing the heat, which increases this process, the breakdown process, to happen. Okay, then we want to stress a few experiments. So the first experiment that you need to know the concept about is that carbon dioxide is produced during aerobic respiration, and we want to prove this. So an example that one can look at is by using animals to see whether they actually use oxygen and release carbon dioxide. I wanted to show you guys a nice or a cute video about it, but unfortunately I couldn't find the right type of one. But here's a pretty schematic representation of it, a picture of what one can do. So in this experiment, it's a bit different than the one in the book, is they use a bottle over here with lime water. Lime water is actually calcium hydroxide. And basically what happens, why they use this, is because when it reacts with carbon dioxide, it will turn milky. So it is clear, the lime water, it looks like water, but as soon as carbon dioxide mixes with it, with the lime, it turns a milky color, milky white color. So in this experiment, they had 2 bottles, the rat in the middle, and he is using oxygen and expelling carbon dioxide, theoretically. So we're trying to see whether this is really happening, whether he is expelling or breathing out carbon dioxide. Okay, so normal air comes in, it reacts with lime water, then it's supposed to go through to the rat. He's supposed to release carbon dioxide, and it's supposed to react with this bottle, bottle B, and then go out. So let's see what the results are. So when the water comes in, the lime water stays colorless. So we know in this case there is no carbon dioxide within the air. It's supposed to be oxygen, nitrogen, all those types of gases that is naturally in the air, but primarily supposed to be oxygen. So and with no carbon dioxide. So it stays colorless as it goes through, and the rat does his breathing thing. In the bottle B, the lime water will turn milky, or the color of milk. So this shows that the rat actually breathes oxygen and expels carbon dioxide. So it's important to know you get two types when they ask you this experiment in the exam. They can either use soda lime or lime water. So the soda lime is actually sodium hydroxide, and what this does is a pretty picture of what it looks like in pellets. It absorbs carbon dioxide. So if this is mentioned within the experiment, what they show you, know that it's supposed to also react with carbon dioxide, by meaning it absorbs the carbon dioxide, so it kind of vanishes within parentheses from the experiment. As soon as soda lime is there, it absorbs the carbon dioxide. Then with the lime water, which I mentioned in the previous slide, it's calcium hydroxide, and this is shown or is used to show the presence of carbon dioxide. So if you take lime water, which is clear, the more carbon dioxide goes into the lime water, the more milky it becomes. Kind of looks like milk after a while. Sorry, seeing the soda lime here, I just want to mention the previous slide. They put soda lime over here, and this is to take out any carbon dioxide from the air. Okay, so that's why they use the soda lime there, so that you are sure that no carbon dioxide enters your experiment. And the only carbon dioxide that goes into the last bottle should be from the mouse. Okay, so then another experiment, just for interest's sake. The aim is to show that heat is being produced during respiration, as I mentioned in the previous slide as well. So here they use germinating seeds. You have these vacuum-type flasks, and then they put seeds on the inside. In this case, this is your control, so they kind of killed the seeds, they boiled them, so they can't germinate, they're dead. But on this side, they're living seeds. I think they were maybe soaked in water for a while, and now they've started to germinate, so we know they're alive. And then they stop it with a cotton wool at the bottom so nothing falls out, and then in the middle of both of them they have a thermometer to measure the temperature on the inside. Okay, so this is the experiment with the live beings. This is the control with the dead ones. So let's see what happens. The result is that your temperature will actually rise on the thermometer of your experiment, and nothing is supposed to happen on the control. So this shows that living seeds, they produce heat. So temperature rose because germinating pea seeds release heat during respiration. Okay, so that was our aerobic respiration. Then we have anaerobic respiration. This process happens in the absence of oxygen. No oxygen is present during this type of reaction. Okay, so there are two steps within this type of respiration. You remember glycolysis. As with aerobic respiration, we start off with glucose, this step. So we have the glucose, and interestingly, they didn't show it in the previous picture, but even with aerobic respiration, you need ATP to actually break down the glucose. But then, even though this happens and you need ATP, or you need energy to break it down, during this process you also produce energy, because as the previous one, 2 hydrogen atoms will be released. So in this case, with the anaerobic respiration, the coenzyme NAD catches those 2 hydrogen atoms and now carries it to the second step. Okay, so even though we use energy to break down the glucose to pyruvate or pyruvic acid molecules, some energy is also still being produced despite this. Okay, so these 2 hydrogen molecules will be used in the last step. So the last step can be one of 2 things. The pyruvic acid can either be broken down to lactic acid or lactate, or it can be broken down into carbon dioxide and ethanol, yes, alcohol. Okay, so this last process for both type of steps is known as fermentation. The first step is just known, or this one is known as lactic acid fermentation because you end up with lactic acid. And the second one is known as alcohol fermentation because we end up with ethanol, which is pure alcohol, and carbon dioxide is being released as a byproduct. Okay, so usually lactic acid, this step usually happens in animals or humans like us when we exercise, and unfortunately it happens that no oxygen or not enough oxygen is being used, then we produce in our muscles lactic acid. But the alcohol fermentation happens in yeasts, your smaller type of organisms that usually don't need oxygen anyway, so they produce energy without oxygen. So they use this type of route, and ethanol is being produced with carbon dioxide. Okay, so looking at the two anaerobic respiration equations or chemical formula for alcoholic fermentation, for your bacteria and your yeasts and things, they take the glucose and through enzymes and temperature is broken down into ethanol and your carbon dioxide and your ATPs, energy. Despite the energy over here and here being a bit different, it still produces 2 ATP no matter which one you use. 2 ATPs being produced, not a lot. So this process of anaerobic respiration is an energy poor type of way of making energy. Only 2 ATP will be produced. And then with your lactic acid fermentation, which happens in animals or humans like us, not in our muscles, it takes the glucose molecule with enzymes and temperature broken down into lactic acid and then your 2 ATP. So again, you don't produce a lot of energy with this process. Okay, so then it's important to know what's the difference between your aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. So what's being produced, what is needed, and so on. So first of all, with your aerobic respiration, again, this needs oxygen. You produce, need, yes, oxygen and glucose. So oxygen should come in and glucose is needed for it to start. But with the anaerobic respiration, only glucose is needed. So you start with the glucose and you go on. No oxygen. Secondly, for aerobic respiration, it produces CO2, carbon dioxide, and it produces water. Okay, but anaerobic respiration, it produces alcohol, and in this step, alcohol and carbon dioxide, or in the other step, lactic acid. So with aerobic respiration, lastly, again, it's an energy-rich type of respiration. It makes 38 ATP or energy molecules, the 2 plus 36. And then the anaerobic respiration only makes 2 ATP. It's energy poor cycle, energy poor type of respiration. Okay, then what are our uses or the benefits of anaerobic respiration without oxygen and so on? Because as we mentioned, fermentation happens, and what do we as humans usually eat or use because of fermentation is basically all these byproducts, cheeses, beer, wine, and even bread. So we, during this process, we know glucose is used, pyruvate is then, glucose is being broken down, pyruvate is created, and then depending on the type of yeast or bacteria that you use, different products can be produced for human consumption. So through that lactic acid pathway, it can either be things like soy sauce and cheese can be made, or through the ethanol pathway, we can have things like beer, well, plain wine, ethanol, or with the carbon dioxide produced through this ethanol pathway, we get something called bread. Okay, so for humans, it's very beneficial to know about anaerobic respiration because we can make, through biotechnology or the use of these organisms, we can manufacture food and other products for our consumption. Okay, then just lastly, I want to show you an interesting experiment you can actually do at home. So what you do is you put yeast and sugar and warm water in a bottle. So the yeast is your product. You want actually fermentation to happen. So you have the yeast microorganisms, give them some food to eat, like sugar, which is your glucose, and place it in warm water for the reaction to happen. So then you wait 15, 30 an hour or minutes and then to an hour or 2 hours. And what will happen if you put the balloon over the bottle? The balloon will actually start to inflate. Because why? Carbon dioxide is being released through the pathway of while ethanol is being made through fermentation. The carbon dioxide will be released, and where does it go? It can only go upwards because nothing else is open, and then your balloon will be inflated. So go ahead and try that at home. And that, in a nutshell, is your cellular respiration.